Welcome to the Ultra Origins series, where we hear from runners who have recently finished their first ultra or completed a new distance. In these conversations, we celebrate regular people who are doing hard things. There's a lot we can learn from and be inspired by from people just like you. Today on Ultra Origins, we meet Gandhi, an inspiring ultra runner who transformed his life through endurance running. From 5Ks to 200-mile races, shares his journey of overcoming personal challenges, embracing failure as growth, and redefining what's possible, one step at a time. And before we start, a note from me with my editor hat on. As I'm putting this together, I had downloaded all the clips and brought them with me on this trip. And there were some problems with the media, unfortunately, in the interview recorded with And whatever the system that we used, the audio, unfortunately, I think because of some network problems, has a few glitches in it. So I'm sorry about that. I tried to edit out some of the pauses and try to make it make sense. But there are some issues in this episode. But in any case, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Gandhi. I'm just so happy to have you on. I know we've known each other for a few years, and I love seeing you at races. And so when I got to see you a few times this year because of a couple of my volunteering sessions, it was just such a joy. And so I'm really happy to welcome you on to Ultra Origins, And why don't you start off by introducing yourself and tell us where you're calling from? And I look forward to hearing a little bit about your early days.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Wes. I'm really excited to do this. My name is and I'm from Los Angeles, California, born and raised. And I started my running journey back in 2018. I'm not a lifelong athlete. Wow. I've never used to do endurance sports. And I went on a weight loss journey when I was 18 years old due to a pre-diabetes diagnosis, and just started losing weight over the next couple years and kind of went up and down. And then flash forward to when I was 25 years old, working a high stress job. And running was the first time I turned to something for reasons other than like just exercise. I turned to running for an outlet for mental health reasons. And my journey started with a quarter of a mile one evening. That was one of the most nauseating things I ever did. Something kept bringing me back to it, and I just kept setting new benchmarks for myself, and you know how that goes.
So in what year was that you started the mental health running because of stress? What year were you talking about?
So this was 2018. So okay. I started in April of 2018. So I'm about 6.5 years into my running journey now.
And when you said you were sort of building up, growing in your sort of the moment or the volume that you were running and training, were you running any races in those early days, some shorter distances stuff?
Yeah, so for me, like running was like my Goliath, like it was like a colossal goal for me. It scared me because I had tried a few times before to do similar goals in endurance, and I quit very fast. I started a run-walk plan and wanted to see if I could even run for 10 minutes straight. And I set this big goal running for 30 minutes straight. And at that time, I signed up for my first 5K. I've always been a person who sets colossal goals that I have no idea how I'm going to finish. So I set myself up for a 5K. And 4 months after that, I got into, it was almost sort of like a fun bet with a coworker. And I ended up signing up for a half marathon at Joshua Tree, which at the time I did not know that was not going to be a road race. And that was actually going to be a lot of dirt and trail. So it was like my soft introduction to trail running.
So wait, did you accidentally get into trail running?
I accidentally got into trail running. And it's funny because I always talk about how Joshua Tree was my first half marathon, but I think this might be the first minute on the podcast that I got into trail running officially in 2020, but unofficially, I think 2018, doing the Joshua Tree.
I love that.
I was out in the sand and had no idea what I was getting into. I built myself up from 30 minutes of running to a 5K, did a 10K and a half, and ended up doing 3 or 4 half marathons leading up to 2019. And late 2019, I signed up for my first marathon. And of course, we all know what happened in 2020. So that kind of changed my trajectory to trail running.
I feel like you did quite a lot in that first year. I mean, in 2018, when you were starting from zero, wow, having you done a few half marathons, getting ready for that marathon just a year later, that's quite a lot. Did you follow any kind of training plan back in those days to get yourself, kind of getting into the running groove and to start that commitment and dedication to consistent training?
I think did Google research. Hal Higdon
Okay.
was a big fan. I honestly, looking back to those days, I made a lot of mistakes and I realized what I was doing, which honestly, I think a
Mhm.
lot of us are still trying to figure it out. And you never stop, as you know, like even when you get into longer stuff. But
Yeah.
I was so new to running and I hadn't really found the social aspect of running yet. It was just sort of an individualistic thing for me. And so
Mm.
I was learning these things as I was making mistakes with foot care, mistakes with the right kind of socks, the right kind of shoes. And so, like, it was a lot of trial and error. I didn't even know about aerobic training and zone two training until 2 years ago. So there was a lot of just getting out there and doing the run without focusing on effort and all those little intricacies. And I do feel like that is the beauty of running. I think it's as simple as you want to make it, just putting on your
Right.
workout clothes and going out there, or getting into those little intricacies like effort and workouts, long runs and easy runs. And I think I was discovering that along the way by doing trial and error, which is kind of the story of my life.
Well, it's such a great way to learn too as you're starting out. And you can certainly do research and find out how other people do things and maybe try to learn from their experience by copying their approach and seeing if it works. But having the experience of finding out how your body reacts to something is the most valuable learning. And so making mistakes isn't maybe even necessarily the right word. Learning what your body needs is really what you're doing during those early training days and figuring out what feels good so that you continue to want to do the training. I think it's really good to be learning in those early days. And as you made the comment, we're all still learning even years later.
Yeah, I mean, I think that mistakes is really the best teacher, the best way to grow. I really do find that the principal habits I've built today that have made me a better athlete, I don't know that I would be able to follow them as well as I do without knowing what the other side is like.
Hmm.
Even when I'm giving people advice, even when I'm talking myself into doing something or staying disciplined on something like a recovery routine or a specific type of workout or keeping the easy run easy, I think back to what would happen if I didn't do those things. And I've made those mistakes before. And I think having that example really helped me solidify the foundation that I have today.
Well, the foundation you have today is just absolutely, massive. Or what you're doing these days is massive. You've created a huge foundation for yourself, and yeah, know that you've run a lot of ultras. And I want to talk about your journey into ultras, and I also wanted to talk about this year how many races you've run. You did 300 miles at the beginning of the year, and then you did the triple crown of 200s. It's just so impressive what you have accomplished this year. Really unbelievable. And so I'm so excited to learn how all you made that transition. So after you got into trail running, and obviously you said 2020 happened to put a sort of a pause on all the organized running efforts. What was your first ultra, and how did you make the transition from running, those early running days to having such a big audacious goal to run an ultra marathon?
So the pandemic happened, all the road racing shut down, and I had been training for a marathon. When things shut down, the longest training run I had done was 16 miles. Then, obviously, March of that year happened. I shut down my running for most of that early days of that lockdown. Didn't really know what I was doing. And all of that was kind of intermingling with the tail end of my story of dealing with alcohol and fell a little bit deeper into that during those times. I think I was struggling a bit with identity. And then I had discovered backpacking back in 2019. My whole life, I had grown up in the concrete jungle, basically. I didn't come from a family that really went out to the outdoors. Maybe we made a trip here and there to Yosemite, but I didn't know about like these trails or the backcountry or camping and all of that. And on a whim, I signed up for a Sierra Club course called Wilderness Training Course. And I went there completely alone, came back with a lot of friends, did a bunch of backpacking trips, and fell in love with the outdoors. The reason that's important is because when we came into 2020, it felt like the outdoors was a place where people were starting to circulate to. And I discovered during that time that there was this thing called running on the trails. And I thought, man, I already love to run. It's kind of cool that I get to do this out in the backcountry. And Back in 2018, I had known that 100 milers existed, but, think of it from my perspective. I'm a guy who just did a quarter of a mile, trying to run for 10K, trying to do a 5K, going to a half marathon. When I looked at the people doing 100 miles, I think I'd seen a video of the Brazil 135. I might have seen a video, I think it was Kerry Ward or somebody for Bigfoot 200, but I had only seen glimpses of it because I couldn't wrap my head around it. People running 100 miles and 200 miles. From my perspective, that's got to be like for the most elite athletes in the world, like Olympian level athletes. Like I wouldn't, at the time, understand ever do this in a lifetime. And so COVID happened and the world kind of shut down. And a person who likes to set big goals, and I like, why don't we just go for it? I started watching your video, and I was always kind of in love with the area of Zion. So I thought, why don't I just take a leap and sign up for the 2021 Zion 100? And I always thought like about what could go wrong. Always the overthinker. Still am an overthinker, but started flipping my perspective in the other way. And I thought, but what if I could do it? Like, what's the worst thing that could happen if I failed? So I signed up for the race, and this is July, and now that race is in April. So I have 9 months to train for this race, and I am losing my mind. I'm like, this is the pandemic. Like, people aren't really socializing. Like, I don't know anybody in the ultra trail community. I don't know how I'm going to get there. The internet is a great resource, but I don't even know where to start with what to search for. Like, I figure, what is a race that I could do leading up to it? What are the pillars I can have to build up to it? And some of the things I find are back-to-back long runs, doing a 50K. So I signed up for the Zion 50K because it's also in the same place where they're doing the Zion 100, plus Utah was one of the only places still doing races. That was September of 2020. That was my first ever ultra. And that was an amazing, life-changing experience. But I made, like it's been a trend for me, like I made all the mistakes in the book. Didn't have the proper socks, so my feet were shredded. I didn't know what electrolytes were, so I didn't know what salt tabs were, like race hydration or any of that. I was just living off the aid station, eating some Trader Joe's stuff, like their Stroop waffles, which are delicious. And I got like out of the last aid station, and I'm thinking the bag, then I trip over a rock and I get into like these Charlie horses. And I spend the next 2 miles just marching over the next hour and 45 to 2 hours to the finish line. And I finished my first 50K in hours. I think it was like 9 hours or something. I think 10 was the cutoff. So I finished like one of the last people came in, and somehow that experience made me feel that I needed more. And my first thought was, I will see you in 7 months, Zion. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I mean, you've obviously done Zion too, like going up that mesa, like seeing those views. I'd never seen anything like that in a road race. But more than that, like I made friends out there. I found community out there, and I'd never seen anything like that in any other event I did. And that was, I think there was a shift where running stopped being just this individualistic thing to me. And I started seeing running as a sport where I could find community. And I think that was a trend that would eventually lead me to the distances I do now.
So you learned a lot in the experience of the 50K. You learned about the problems with socks and the problems with nutrition and electrolytes. But maybe the biggest thing you took away was that you're not alone. A lot of people talk about how important the community is to them. But what's so interesting to me is how at this point in your journey, you just discovered that there's a community here. You didn't even know it. And I'm so excited for you because the community is so special. And so, wow, what a neat thing for you to discover in real time there at that race. It must have felt good.
It felt amazing. I mean, I built some friends out there that are people I still keep in touch with, maybe not like day-to-day friends, but Strava friends and people I touch base. Those people reach back and, ask them how they're doing. And they're like, man, you have done a lot since then. And I'm, oh, so have you. Like, I mean, it's just, It's incredible how you meet people out there, and the last thing you ever ask, if you even ask it, is what is your name? And you have these conversations for like
Yeah.
an hour. Like I spent maybe 7 or 8 at the 50K, like almost like that's almost 25% of the race. And I built a friendship there. And, within a half an hour, we're telling vulnerable stories about ourselves. And like the mask is really off these races. And you're not faking out there. There's that, like, it's, I mean, for starters, it takes too much fake out there, or put a mask on out, like you're at
That's
a
true.
party or something. Like you are literally just real self, meeting other people in their real self. You're bounded by the fact that you guys all signed up for this pain. So you have that in common. And so it's amazing how people get vulnerable and build connections out there.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. I'm smiling and just and so happy feeling and thinking about the feelings I have with the people I meet on the trail, because they're so similar to what you're describing. So, how did your training go from that 50K to now, a lot more miles as you train for your first 100 miler?
I would say up and down. Like I think my training started out, the 50K obviously taught me a lot about what I need to do and what mistakes I need to fix. So I learned a lot from that experience. I hadn't still discovered the full extent of aerobic training at this time. All the books I'd been reading were about that mindset of like, grinding every day and staying tough and staying hard. Yeah. And at the time, I mean, it was I think we all need certain things for where we are in life at the time. And I had been coming to the tail end of dealing with alcoholism. There were a lot of things going on in my life at the time. And running was sort of still that individualistic outlet for mental health. For me, it felt good to get out there, and I was working very hard on all my runs. I'd started to discover more of the nuances and intricacies though, like back to back long runs. I knew that those were the big key. Like I knew I had to figure out nutrition, but I was still a little misguided at the end of 2020. And then I got hit with a bout of COVID, and that put me out for about a month and dropped my fitness for a while, to the point where I didn't know that if I was going to be able to. There was a bit of reasonable doubt that I was ever going to be able to hit that 100-mile mark, and I was ready to give up. And none of this would have ever happened. And then I sort of started to come on the mend and bounce back. And then in January, I signed up for my second 50K as things were starting to open up. This is January of 2021. And by chance, at that 50K, I met my first coach. We just happened to run into each other on the first loop of this race, this 50K. And we spent the entire 50K together. And 15 miles in, I asked this person if they wanted to be my coach. Her only thing was, I will coach you if you choose to be coachable. For her, that was teaching me things that required me to unlearn some of the bad habits I had created. From that point on, I can't even imagine for her as a coach looking at my plan and saying, I've signed up for 2 more 50Ks. That second 50K was first week of February. So I think at that point, I have 2 months essentially to do my final training block for my very first 100 miler. I don't know that I could have done it without her. She helped me figure out things like gear and like equipment. It was my first like big connection in the ultra trail community among a few others. I met other people at those 50Ks, and I started building this base of knowledge. And so when I showed up to my 100-miler at Zion, like I felt like I had gained so much more experience, but I still remember showing up to that start line of that 100-miler still going like, is this really happening? Like it was only 3 short years ago that I thought that this was something that I couldn't do. And I'm standing among all these people, and I got this sense of like, which I think is just insecurity speaking to you, the sense of like imposter syndrome, which I think we all have to some degree, trail space, but all different facets of our lives. And I just remember like being emotional, thinking like, I cannot believe I'm among these incredible people. And then I started the race, wiped the tears out of my eyes. And for the first 10 minutes, when that first mile clicked by, I knew that I had this long journey ahead of me. I really felt like I belonged and that I was meant to do this and I had work for this. So to put a cap on the 100-mile at Zion, I finished the DFL finisher. It was a rolling start, so I think they gave you 36 hours and 5 minutes. I finished in 36:03. It was very, very close. And I'd done that race in a way where I thought that it was going to be the last thing I'd ever do. And then I crossed the finish line and I realized, wow, like I want to do more of this. And a week before Zion 100 happened, I had submitted an article to Run Try Bike, which had submitted a how it all started story about my starting with a quarter of a mile journey. And the person who had submitted a week before was doing this crazy thing that I couldn't even wrap my head around called the Triple Crown of 200s. And I said, what the heck is that? Like, I'm here trying to do a 100, and there's this thing called the Triple Crown of 200s. And granted, I had seen your video of Moab at the time. I know I had seen something about Bigfoot, but it was like glimpses, and I hadn't like wrap my head around these are all destination trail races. These are all part of this category, because we still considered a 200 mile still kind of like a fairly new distance. But, at the time it was even like people had no idea what was going on here. And so I reached out to this person and I asked him what that was all about. And I finished my first 100 miler. And then I said, well, hey, like, do you need like support for those races? I had no idea. I knew about pacers from at that time, but I didn't know what it meant to be part of like a crew or anything like that. I said, do you need like crew pacer help? And I was able to lend support for Bigfoot and for Moab.
Okay.
And so I ended up coming out for this person for Bigfoot 200. And yeah, I had no idea what I was getting into. Like, if you can imagine having done these races yourself, like you first discover a 200 miler, you go out there, first race you ever crew is the Bigfoot 200.
But at that point, you didn't have it in your mind that you might run it. You were just there. You're interested. You're curious about it, right? But at this point, were you there to crew because you wanted to run it, or were you there to crew just so that you could help out and support this runner?
Oh, I kind of wanted to run it. And I think it was something that processed over a few weeks. And then coincidentally, that June of 2021 was the first time Candace opened the Triple Crown registration. And you know how I am with going for big goals. So right. A 5K, if you put it into perspective, right, a 5K to a half marathon is a very big jump for somebody who is only just starting to run, can only run for 5 minutes straight. 16 miles to 100 miler is a very big jump. So for me, call it ignorance, but for me, like 100 miler to doing 3 200s, knowing that there was a 2-year deferral policy in case I wasn't ready, felt like a reasonable risk to go after. And I had started to adopt this mindset that I still adopt to this very day of like failing big. I changed my perception of like failure being in the negative connotation and realizing that all the I had grown the most. So I knew that my worst case scenario was that even if I failed, I would fail big, which is still a victory in the sense that like would I grow if I did a distance that I knew I could already do versus chasing after a big goal that there's a reasonable doubt that I could do it, but like I will get so much on the way from chasing something that's scary. And for me, the Triple Crown, I asked myself the question, what is the next thing that really makes me like sweat bullets like I did for Zion? And it was a Triple Crown. So I signed up for it and ended up where I am now. So really the Triple Crown was the entire first chapter of my ultra career. And that all came to a close just this October. I knew that I wanted to do it. And I knew that the only way to figure out how to run this distance was to go out and volunteer, pace and crew this distance and figure out what I'm getting myself into.
You learn so much by being in the environment of the 200. You get to know the vibe. You get to sort of understand how the aid stations work. What you get to see what runners are experiencing and see their pain. And so that's really instructive if you're interested in the distance. So you signed up for the Triple Crown in 2021, right?
So I signed up for it in 2021, knowing that I was probably not going to do it in 2022, that I was going to defer to 2023. So there's no way I would have signed up if they had said you have to
Right.
do it
Okay.
next year, but there was a 2-year, 100% deferral policy. Next step after volunteering and pacing at these 200s was to find a. After pacing Moab and crew those races, I ended up signing up for the 72-hour race at Across the Years so that I could test my sleep strategy and my nutrition strategy in a controlled environment.
Smart. Yeah.
And then I had this thought on a whim, like, I'm doing the Triple Crown in 2023. Maybe I should just go for Moab in 2022. Like, what is the worst thing that could happen? The worst thing that could happen is I could gain some more experience. I didn't know I was going to get in, but sure enough, I got in. So I think those experiences kind of towards that. And I think it all kind of the same structure of like setting the big goal and how am I going to build towards that.
Yeah. Did you experience very much difference in training and how you trained for Zion and your first 100 and how you started to train for your first 200?
I honestly had no idea how to train for a 200. I was training for it the same way I was training for a 100. When I did Across the Years, I learned that there are like different little details that important sleep is. I hadn't quite figured it out, but I did realize the importance of it. Nutrition varies a little bit, a lot more real food, like you're moving at such a slower pace that your stomach reacts in a different way, that you need different types of nutrition. And I realized like some of the intangible aspects of it, like how there's so much more problem solving involved in a 200-mile distance versus the 100-miler, knowing that like you were going for more than one night. Any mistake now will compound down the road. And I think that those things really help me mature and grow towards that distance. And then in 2022, I did that solo, no pacers, no crew. And I made it to 235 miles and I DNF'd that race, which was
So
insane.
close to the end.
But I'm so proud of that effort. Like it was like, it's stuff you never forget, but I was so proud of all the things I learned. And that in itself also set me on a new evolution as an athlete and helped me realize more things. Again, kind of going back to the fail big mentality. Like it doesn't mean it doesn't suck, but I definitely learned things from it that have helped me be a better athlete today and set me up for a really strong 2024.
Well, yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about what you did in 2024. So let's talk a little bit about that. Why don't you tell us about the overall plan that you had going into this year and what the events you had planned, and then we can talk a little bit about each of them and how this audacious goal, because like you have done, you're always adding bigger and bigger goals as you go. So this is a big one. Tell us about it.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things I do when 2022 was a very for me. DNF'd 5 races. 4 of the 5 DNFs I had were in 2022. 2022 was a compounding year of that mentality of going hard, doing as many races as possible. 100 milers, I DNF'd a stage race in a jungle. I ended up DNFing Moab. And I injured myself at Moab, which put me out for 8 weeks and forced me to reinvent how I viewed running as this individualistic thing of like pushing hard all the time versus like just one facet of a multifaceted human being in life, and it being like a balancing pillar of all the aspects of my life. And I think that helped set me up for a complete reinvention. I started aerobic training seriously. I learned more of the nuances. And then I worked my way up from 50K to doing a 45-miler. I did a foot race in Everest last year called the Everest Ultra. I took my second crack at a trail 200 by doing the Oregon 200 last year, a race we both did together, and ended up finishing that. That set me up to build on that foundation and help learn these new skills now that I had reinvented some facets of my running to be more healthy and built a stronger foundation. I could go even bigger, which was just doing the Triple Crown. I realized like there's a 100-miler I want to do at Antelope. That was my first DNF ever. I wanted to go back and finish that race. I wanted to go back to Across the Years. At the end of 2022, after Moab, I had done the 6-day race. I did the around the clock challenge and I finished 232 miles, and I did a mile every hour for 144 hours, which only stressed the importance of sleep in my mind. And I realized I wanted to go back and do the 6-day race again. And I thought, man, I kind of want to experiment on myself. What if I sleep? It's ATY, so you don't have to worry about where a sleep station is. I wanted to hours every night. Could you, in theory, be on your feet less and still have a stronger distance, go longer and be stronger? And like that ended up becoming its whole own thing, building towards the Triple Crown, but also ended up becoming its own race. Why don't I just make this a Grand Slam, 300 ATY, and then going for 3 200s? Because people in the 200s love to do our Grand Slams. All of that sort of came together. I love stage racing and the self-sufficient formats. I signed up for the Highland Ultra in Scotland as my last big build-up race towards the Triple Crown. It was a 75-mile stage race over 3 days with, I think, close to 23,000 feet of gain. And it's a self-sufficient format, so you have to your sleep system carry all your food for 3 days, and so you're carrying about 30 pounds on your back while dealing with Scottish weather in the Highlands. But it does help you like tie into the. I think it did definitely tie into the power hiking aspect of a 200, so it helped me out in that, especially building towards.
Yeah, for sure.
I did feel like I had stronger climbing legs for Tahoe and Bigfoot because of Highland Ultra.
So the 6-day race you did at the beginning of this year at ATY, that's where you did the 300 miles. I understand, and you did that with 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night?
Yeah, correct. So my strategy was going towards 40, 45 miles single day, like for the first 10, 11 hours on that loop. And then going to sleep at my normal bedtime for 4 to 5 hours, depending on how much I needed, waking up and then just walking around loops until the start of the next day, until I hit 50 on a given single day. And I started out really slow. That first 24 hours was lazy, I think 45, 50 miles. That was intentional because I really wanted to learn how to get as close to negative splitting as possible, which is something my coach Peter Mortimer was emphasizing. Another person I should emphasize that started coaching me in June of 2023 that I couldn't have hit these goals without, because again, I was a lost cause trying to figure out how to train for a 200. And then I figured I'm very serious about this. So I want to hire a coach who has excelled at this distance and is a 200-mile specialist, because there are certain things that people who have excelled at this distance know about training for this distance. And Pete taught me a lot of things that helped me build towards that. But that was essentially, going back to ATY, that was essentially my strategy every single day, was to try to sleep 4 or 5 hours. And it wasn't perfect. I noticed that my sleep got worse as I got later into the race. Like I couldn't sleep down as long, like the pain was keeping me up. That helped me realize for the Triple Crown that banking sleep early was the best bet, because I knew that it just gets harder way later into the race. And so I think that ATY was hard. It also helped me with my pain threshold, because you're just hitting flat for 300 miles. I didn't gain 1,000 feet until 150 miles in. So it really, I think there's a sense of confidence knowing that if I could do 300 miles, then there for sure I could tackle a 200,
Yeah. What was your recovery like coming out of that 300 miles of flat running in that sort of format with a lot of rest? I'm curious to know how the recovery was for that event.
It still took me 6 weeks from it, I think, and feel like myself. I was back to training after 2.5 weeks. So I was back to like running and building volume back up towards the Antelope 100 in March. But it did take me 6 weeks for me to, I would feel like myself, to see my heart rate levels come back down, to kind of shrug off the internal damage. And I do think that it would have been a lot worse if I hadn't gotten that sleep. I think that flat, just, you're beating up the same muscles over and over again, your hip flexors, your glutes, you're using the same things over and over again. So I think the repetitive beating put me out for about 6 weeks until I could feel like I was back at my normal baseline. But one of the things that my coach emphasized with the 300 miler and the 100 miler and the Scotland race is that he didn't really have to put me through too many long runs. We had a cox, but he said, you don't need a long run. You have these races are your long run. So we've intentional workouts like power hiking workouts and speed workouts and a couple easy runs. And so the volume in between those races wasn't as high as you would expect it to be because those races were the long efforts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, that feels like a really smart perspective, and also probably doesn't put you undue stress on your body in between each of the events.
Yeah,
Which is important.
definitely.
Yeah.
And it's always a trial and error, like yourself from like doing the Grand Slam. When I got to Moab, I obviously didn't finish this year. I got to 82 miles and I dropped out. But I think that I could feel the fatigue accumulating with each race. Tahoe was the race where I felt the strongest. I had a really great performance that race. Bigfoot, I had a strong performance, but I could really feel the fatigue creeping in mentally. And then Moab, I was about 9 miles in and I said, what the heck is going on? I could really feel the fatigue of the Triple Crown and couldn't imagine when people were doing them 4 weeks apart. I just got to give kudos to anybody doing multiple 200s in a year. The mental and emotional, like physical toil it takes on you.
Yeah, it sure is. Well, and it's an incredible achievement to do not only the Triple Crown, but the 200s you did in the spring, followed by the 300 miles at ATY. A tremendous thing when you put it all together. Now you've come to the end of this big project of 2024 and all this stuff. As you reflect back, what is your biggest takeaway? How do you feel you have been stretched, and how have you grown in this year through this experience?
I think just grown by realizing that, you would think that a failure like this would make you think I'm not capable of this, but really, it's made me realize like I'm capable of so much more, not just in ultra running, but in all the facets of my life. It's carried over to every facet of my life. And I had to reframe it. And I think conversations like these continue to help me reframe it, that 6 years ago, I was running a quarter of a mile. The goals that I am setting for myself now are things that I couldn't even fathom. I wouldn't even be able to set those goals back then because they are not things I couldn't even envision for myself. And the fact that I was not only setting that goal, but towing the line at any race like that, let alone 1 200, 200s, or like Crown, is just, it's helped me realize that like the only person who can limit you is yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's true in everything. And like, that helped me realize like, I had a fantastic conversation with Peter who said like, who essentially said, you were just like me. You came into the sport, came out hard, did a lot of races, and then you took a step back and you realized so much more. And so I've definitely, like, people have asked, like, how do you build on top of this? Like, how do you do this? Do you go farther and farther and farther? And that you don't necessarily have to. Like for me, my next goal in mid-December is to do a fast 5K, which is painful. Like,
yeah, that sounds really hard.
It all comes back to what scares you, right? And
yeah.
Honestly, I would sign up for 100 miles. This is crazy to say, but I would sign up for 100 miles tomorrow before I do a day where I'm in zone 5 for 20 minutes straight, Right. So
I totally get it.
I said doing shorter, faster stuff and focusing on building speed and doing 2 speed workouts a week for the start of this training block. And one of the things that I had always escaped by doing so many races was putting together disciplined long training blocks. And so I have the goal in my mind that in 2025, I don't have anyone in the 200. In 2026, I will be back to that distance because that distance is not going anywhere. And I plan on just focusing on structure and just realizing that I'm capable of so much more if I take the time and really focus and fix all the bad habits and take all these lessons. And I know that I want to do the sport for a long time. When I faced myself with the question of, do you want to do a lot of these all at once? For what was my relative limit at that time, and like fizzle out? Or is this something that you want to do for a long time? And I realized that this is a sport that I want to do as long as I can run. And The moment I started playing in decades, taking the time to build for a couple years, have more years like this to come is just absolutely worth it. And so many, and know yourself, like there's so many ways you can get involved in this community. I will be pacing and crewing a friend who crewed me at Bigfoot. I'll be crewing Cocodona for the first time. We'll be pacing my coach, Peter Mortimer, at Moab in 2024, which I could, for some reason, since 2021, I've been so that's just part of tradition. But
I love it.
You can step back and do your thing, and the distances will always be there for you. You don't always have to wear the racer hat. You can wear the aid station captain hat, the volunteer hat, the pacer hat, and still be a part of all the fun.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The community welcomes everybody and needs everybody, and you get so much satisfaction when you're serving others and being on that side too. Hearing all the wisdom that you have to share and what you've learned over these years, these short years, you've learned so much in a really short amount of time, but it's so inspiring. And I love hearing you talk about reframing things that maybe you didn't achieve the goal that you had set out in mind, but yet you achieved so much in even just trying it. I mean, 2024 is still a huge success in my mind when I think about what you've done. It's so inspiring. I'm really grateful for you coming on. Before we wrap up our time together, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think I would just say somebody like, even if it's not a 200-mile, if it's something related to business or life or whatever, if it's something that scares you and also excites you in a good way, then just go for it. Like, you're going to make mistakes along the way. Nobody's got to figure it out. We're all continuing to try to figure it out. And the more you go into it, the more you realize there's so much more to learn. But that's where the growth is. Like, I don't know that without these leaps, I would be standing here on this. I would be here on the show. I don't know, able to have the experiences that I have, meet the people I meet, and to grow towards being the person that I strive to be if it wasn't for all the failures that I experienced. And just remember that failure is not a negative word. It's a building block to success.
That's right. It's learning. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, cool. So good to see you and talk with you. I wish you so much luck in your fast 5K. I look forward to hearing how that goes, but we'll be definitely seeing each other at future events. Great to see you, my friend. And I hope you have a really good rest of this winter time as you get ready for your next things. And I'll be seeing you online, and hopefully I will also see you on the trail. Good to see you, my friend. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Wes.
Thank you for being our guest, Ohm. It's always such a joy to speak with you. And thank you, audience, for following Ultra Origins this year. It was very gratifying for me to meet all these wonderful and inspiring people. I'm very grateful to every guest who came on to share their story. This is the last episode of this season of Ultra Origins. Thank you for listening.